Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sim Gill, Salt Lake County DA, and I'm here today to share with you our findings from the Salt Lake City Police Department's officer-involved shooting on February 10th of 2020, occurring at 125 South 300 East against one Michael Tyson Nance. And the shooting officers were Officers Christopher Jepson, Officer Hayden Cassidy, and Officer Chad Miller. Before I present my findings, I want to take a moment to acknowledge, as it will become clear, the death of Natalie Thurber, who was a victim of an alleged homicide and resulting from an alleged domestic violence incident that the Salt Lake City police officers were responding to. My office and I send our condolences to Natalie's family for their loss. And I also want to take a moment to state that our review of this shooting incident will focus on what the officers observed and knew for the purposes of using lethal force in their official capacity as police officers. Today's discussion regards the use of deadly force, as I said, against Michael Tyson Nance on February 10 of 2020. On February 20th of 2020, the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office charged Mr. Nance with one count of criminal homicide, aggravated murder, a first-degree felony, one count of attempted criminal homicide, aggravated murder, a first-degree felony, and one count of aggravated kidnapping, a first-degree felony, and one count of aggravated assault, a third-degree felony. These charges arise from Mr. Nance's alleged conduct on February 10, 2020, and many of the facts of which are covered in our review of the officer's use of deadly force, and which are outlined in our formal document, a letter that we sent to Chief Mike Brown and Salt Lake County Sheriff Rosie Rivera, and we'll discuss that in a second. Today's discussion regards our review of and findings and conclusions about the officer's use of deadly force, not the criminal charges against Mr. Nance or the allegations related thereto. Mr. Nance is presumed innocent of the charges and the allegations against him. That presumption of innocence, together with Mr. Nance's right to a fair trial and other due process rights, obligates us to see that Mr. Nance is accorded procedural justice and that his guilt is decided upon the basis of sufficient evidence. Therefore, we will not address Mr. Nance's alleged conduct beyond the need to articulate the basis of our findings about officers' use of deadly force. And to the extent that we refer to Mr. Nance's alleged conduct, we remind the public that Mr. Nance is presumed innocent of the charges and the allegations of wrongdoing against him. And what we'll do is I'm going to give you the factual basis, and then we will go through a couple of videos that we have to articulate our findings. We looked at a lot of video that was there, and what we will show you are snippets of the video, and the complete videos would otherwise be too long. This review addresses the use of deadly force by Salt Lake City Police Department, as I said, Officer Jepson, Cassidy, and Miller. On February 10th of 2020, it is important to note that Salt Lake City PD Officer Chad Miller also, when he fired his weapon, but under different circumstances from Officer Jepson and Officer Cassidy, and we will highlight that in our findings as well. As I indicated, Mr. Nance survived the injuries that he sustained. The factual basis and findings that we had are as follows. On February 10th of 2020, Salt Lake City PD properly initiated the OICI protocol, and such that the protocol investigators were called to conduct an independent investigation of the officer's weapons discharge, and the protocol investigation's independent investigating findings were presented to the DA's office to screen for possible criminal charges against the involved officers for their use of deadly force. The following facts were developed from the protocol investigation. Should additional or different facts subsequently come to light, the opinions and conclusions contained may likewise be different as well. In the early morning hours of February 10, 2020, Salt Lake City police officers received a 911 call with no one apparently on the line. In the background, dispatchers could hear a man and a woman talking. The man was talking about not letting the woman leave the apartment. There was discussion about a knife, the man saying, "I don't want to kill you," and the information that led dispatchers to believe that the man in the background had attacked the woman. About the same time, Salt Lake City PD dispatchers also received a call from a woman we refer to as NY, who told dispatchers that she received a text from her friend named Natalie Thurber. NY said that Natalie's boyfriend, Tyson, was trying to kill Natalie. NY told police dispatchers that Natalie lived in apartment 103, but did not have the street address or the apartment building. So there was the first call, but they didn't know where to go. And then there was a subsequent second call, which said apartment 103, but didn't know the address. Police dispatchers used technology to narrow down the location of the phone call coming from the man and woman, and sent officers to the area of 115 South 300 East on a report of an unknown problem. Officers arrived in the area of two multi-story apartment buildings about 5 minutes after the dispatchers received the first call with the man and the woman on the line. It was about 3:45 a.m. Salt Lake City Police Officer Jepson got out of his patrol car and walked around the area of the apartment buildings, trying to ascertain which apartment unit the call for help was coming from. Officer Jepson saw a light on the inside a basement apartment. Officer Jepson walked to the apartment window and heard what he later described as a quiet scream and gurgling from a woman inside the apartment. Officer Jepson said that he heard a man tell the woman to be quiet. Officer Jepson stepped away from the window and used his police radio to tell dispatchers that he believed that he had located the call for help and identified the specific address. Then the other officers headed to that location. Officer Jepson said that he could hear the situation, so he then returned. So he moved away from there, went away to let the other officers know, then he ran back to the same area where he had heard that sound. Officer Jepson said that he could hear that the situation inside the apartment was getting worse. The man inside the apartment was saying, quote, shut up, end quote, and the woman's gurgling continued. Officer Jepson drew his firearm and kicked the glass out of the apartment's window inside the apartment. This was actually in an alley, and this is actually the bathroom window that he was listening from, and he kicked that in. Officer Jepson saw a man standing and a woman kneeling facing Officer Jepson. The man had both arms around the woman and was choking her out. The woman had her arms on the man's arm, trying to pull his arms away from her throat. Officer Jepson ordered the man to drop it. The man immediately released the woman and said, okay, and backed up around the corner of the room. The man was behind a wall separating the room from a hallway. So this was actually in the bathroom, the door frame, and then there's a wall, and he stepped behind it. At that time, they released the woman behind it. The woman looked at Officer Jepson and said, quote, help. Salt Lake City Officer Miller had arrived on the scene and walked up behind Officer Jepson. As Officer Jepson looked to see Officer Miller, he heard two pops from inside the apartment. He turned back to the apartment and saw the woman on the ground and not moving. Officer Jepson said he looked back and saw Officer Miller drop to the ground and grab his chest. Officer Jepson turned back to the apartment and saw the muzzle of a gun appear around the corner of the wall behind which the man had gone. Officer Jepson aimed his weapon at the wall where he believed the man was located and fired his police weapon several times. When he stopped firing, Officer Jepson said he heard a man screaming. When Officer Cassidy had arrived at the apartment building, he saw Officer Jepson and Officer Miller standing outside the basement apartment window. In his interview with protocol investigators, Officer Cassidy said that he heard two gunshots and saw Officer Miller fall to the ground and saw blood coming from underneath Officer Miller. Officer Cassidy went to the window with Officer Jepson and heard another gunshot emanating from inside the apartment. Officer Cassidy aimed his police weapon at the wall where he believed the gunshot came from and fired. Officer Miller, who had also Officer Miller survived his gunshot wound injury, and when he was interviewed by the protocol investigators, during his interview, Officer Miller said he did not fire his weapon during the incident. Investigators informed Officer Miller that in their review of the body-worn camera footage appeared to show Officer Miller fire one shot from his police firearm. Investigators also determined that Officer Miller's weapon was down one round. It appears that Officer Miller was shot very close in time or contemporaneously with his weapon discharge. We don't know whether being shot caused a sympathetic reaction or whether the trauma of being shot caused Officer Miller to not remember his weapon discharge. Mr. Nance was apprehended and treated for his gunshot wound injuries. He survived, and as I indicated, we filed the subsequent charges against him. At this time, what I would like to draw, I'm going to show you 3 videos. One is Officer Jepson, then followed by Officer Cassidy, then by Officer Miller, and then we will slow down Officer Miller's video, and then we will also show you one still photograph. So, Ben, would you go ahead and turn down the lights? Ben, do we have a thing? That's okay. So this is Officer Jepson's video. What I want to set this up is that the dispatch has gotten a call. It is a live call, but there is no address on it. So they were able to narrow the area where they believed this distress call was coming from. Officers had responded. Officer Jepson arrives there. These are the 2 apartment complex buildings. They don't know where it's coming from. And then subsequently, as I mentioned, a second call comes and says it's apartment 103, but they didn't know what the address was. So Officer Jepson has arrived. He goes down this alleyway, and this captures it from this moment. The window will be to your right. The sound, turn the sound up as much as. He goes up, he is hearing. And he's made a determination, he believes that's the source, so he runs back, and he's calling it in because he didn't want to disturb that to alert to get back up. He's done that. And then he comes back. And at this time, it's indicated in his interview, it is escalating.
Please, drop it or I will shoot you right now. Let me see your hands. Challenge you want at gunpoint, he's coming out the back door.
And that's the hand of the victim. She's on her knees, and we're going to stop right there. That is the victim. Next, please. He is knocked. This is from Officer Cassidy's perspective. Okay, and this third one that we will show you is from Officer Miller's perspective. He noticed that Officer Jepson is already there. Understand the position of the window. He kicks it in.
Please, drop it or I will shoot you right now. Let me see your hands. Challenge you want at gunpoint, he's coming out the back door, or the hallway door. Somebody take the north or the west.
Pop. And the second pop. And this is a perspective from Officer Miller getting shot. because there were two pops. There was the first pop,
Under my leg.
a second, there's a first pop, there was a moment of pause, and then the second pop. When we sort of went through and examined it, the first pop is that we believe the shot that injured the victim. The second one is actually aimed at Officer Miller and hits Officer Miller. As Officer Miller goes down, Officer Jepson moves to the side. Then there are a second round of pops. When we looked inside, we saw a bullet that came out from Mr. Nance's direction from there that had hit inside the bathroom, and then the return of fire that occurred at that moment. And as we indicated, that Officer Miller, in his interview, absolutely believed that he did not fire his weapon. So when we went back and slowed it down, I'm going to ask Bill, is that capturing on there? This is a slowed down version of Officer Miller's. He's gun on since Officer Jepson has already broken through there. The suspect at this moment has gone around the corner. And you see there, when we slowed it down, Ben, play that just one more time for me, please. I want you to just keep your eye at the gun sight, that orange little gun sight that you've got, as well as that at the top of the frame. Because Officer Miller had no, and you'll see what we believe to be an orange flash right there. And so we slowed that even further down by frame. So Ben, go to the still if you would. And that is the muzzle that you see, the fire that's coming out of his revolver. And that was really important for us because it's a kind of a unique situation in that we found ourselves that Officer Miller did not recall, and he honestly believed that he did not recall the firing of his weapon. But we knew that from the down count that he was down one bullet. And so that required a different kind of an analysis for us. So as I said, Officer Miller did not said that he did not discharge his weapon. And when presented with the apparent evidence that he did fire his weapon, Officer Miller said that he did not remember firing his weapon. Investigators reviewed frame-by-frame breakdown of his body-worn camera, and investigators determined that the recording depicts Officer Miller firing his weapon. Investigators also determined that Officer Miller's weapon was down one round, consistent with his discharge at the OICI scene. Officer Miller said that he did not remember firing his weapon. It appears that Officer Miller was shot in the leg contemporaneously with his weapon discharge. We don't know whether being shot in the leg caused a sympathetic reaction in which Officer Miller fired his weapon, or whether the trauma of being shot caused Officer Miller not to remember his weapon discharge. We don't know whether other internal or external factors may also account for Officer Miller's apparent inability to remember firing his weapon. But we do believe that the facts of the incident, particularly when considered in the context of Officer Miller said he experienced those facts, tend to support Officer Miller's position that he does not remember firing his weapon. In this case, we don't believe that Officer Miller's weapon discharge, when viewed in the context of the facts of the incident, implicate criminal charges against Officer Miller. Officer Miller's testimony recounts circumstances in which the use of deadly force would be justified. Officer Miller said that he heard gunshots from the apartment and realized that he had been shot in the leg. The fact and the circumstances surrounding Officer Miller's weapon discharge, considered with the testimony of the other officers corroborated by the body-worn cameras, do not support a criminal charge against Officer Miller for his weapon discharge. In other different circumstances, where the facts were distinguishable from the facts of this OICI, and where ostensible lack of memory from a shooting officer was not similarly corroborated by other witness accounts, video recordings, physical evidence, and other independent objective proof, our treatment of that officer's ostensible lack of memory may likewise be different. But in this case, considering the specific individual nature of the events, together with the totality of circumstances as demonstrated from several sources, including independently verifiable objective sources, we believe Officer Miller's weapon discharge does not implicate criminal charges, even if and irrespective of whether he cannot recall discharging that weapon. So this was kind of a very different, unique situation in the totality of that, and that's why we took a little bit of extra time to sort of contextualize that. So in conclusion, we believe that Officer Jepson, Officer Cassidy, and Officer Miller were justified in the use of lethal force because we believe that they reasonably believed that their life or the lives of others were in danger. Before I conclude, I'm going to ask for a point of just sort of personal privilege, and I'll be happy to take your questions afterwards. I know that that around the country and locally, we're having an important conversation about the use of force and the intersection of police conduct in the lives of people of color and specifically African Americans. And I know that's a very important conversation that we should be having, and it's a critical conversation that I believe this time has been long overdue. But I also want to take a second to point out that there are many incidents and contacts, thousands of those, which are in the context of a situation like today, where that trauma and that distress is there. And I just want to take a second to point out the conduct of Officer Jepson. Here was a situation where dispatchers did not know the physical location, but they knew that there was a crime that was afoot. They narrowed it down to a general area, and the effort that Officer Jepson demonstrated in the initiative that he took to discover where that was, the urgency which he alerted the officers, came down there and tried to respond to assist somebody in some incredible circumstances. And I know that his efforts fell short, but it was not because he wasn't trying. And I think that needs to be commended. That was the effort of professionalism that I just wanted to acknowledge. And I know that all the responding officers in this particular situation did their very level best to come to the assistance of a victim. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the great effort of Officer Jepson. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming here, and have a good day.